Welcome, everyone, back to the Field Advisor podcast. I'm Kelsey Litchfield. Today, I'm joined by two soybean experts, and we are going to talk early season soybean management and still some planting because there's still plenty of planting happening around the state of Illinois. But my guests today are Dr. Rachel Vann. She is the Associate Professor of Cropping Systems at the University of Illinois, and she also leads the Science for Success initiative that I encourage you to check out after listening to this podcast. A ton of good resources on the web there. And then we also have Stephanie Porter, who is a certified crop advisor, and she's the outreach agronomist for Illinois Soybean Association. So welcome to you both. Thanks for being here. We're going to start right off with, I know the weather conditions, they're always variable, but it seems like they've been highly variable this spring. You got cooler than normal temps. I've been seeing that all over the place. Scattered rainfall. It's kind of on, off. Even some late frost, early frost, late frost. It seems like the weather just can't pick one season and stick with it, which has created a wide range of field conditions. And some growers are finished. Some are trying to plant. And now I hear this morning, some are trying to replant. So let's start with this. For the farmers that are still planting, what guidance would you give them at this stage? Stephanie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think we, in certain parts of the state, are in the same boat as we were last year. And we had this conversation yesterday when we were talking about scouting. First off, I think based on what you just said, we're going to have a lot of different crops in different growth stages. And so that makes things a lot different. So you have people out there planting or replanting, like you said, but I also see side dressing going on corn right now. So we have a lot of different things happening. Luckily, I think that there's many parts of the states that have dried out at this point in time. And there's a lot of field activity. But if you have not planted your corn yet, this would probably be the time to go ahead and plant your corn. I've talked to a lot of different people, and I know I'm biased, but a lot of people do plant their soybeans early in Illinois, and there's a lot of soybeans planted, around when we start getting around the 15th of May. You want to prioritize the corn just because based on research, you can lose 0.4 to 0.5 bushels an acre when you start to get that mid-May point. But I've also talked to a lot of farmers too that said, hey, my mid-May corn last year was pretty good. So, I mean, this ultimately is not a date thing. It really depends on Mother Nature. And we found that out last year, not only with corn, but also beans. So that was fun. I looked back, Rachel, on our different planting dates that spread, was vastly spread from very early to very late last year. And some of those later planted beans in Southern Illinois did just as well as some of those earlier planted in the North. So you just never know.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting point. I'm coming to this position pretty recently from being in North Carolina, where we're planting from late March to early July by design. That was the plan. That's not because of weather. That's because there's a lot of complexity in the rotations down there. And I always felt like that was an advantage to mitigate risk in some ways to our growers. And we'd have these years, we know how planting date affects soybean yield, but you'd still have these years where farmers had higher yields in their double crop soybeans. And I think that just all gets back to that weather variability that Kelsey mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. And planting date interactions with weather are really interesting. But I think, as we're thinking about what is really important this time of year, when you have early planted soybeans, in my experience, and then you have cooler than normal temperatures, I think a big thing to pay attention to is your early season weed pressure, because soybeans are just growing slowly. I saw on the reports, that 30% of soybeans are emerged in Illinois right now, but they're off to a slow start. And I think that can often sort of intensify pre-emergence herbicide injury and other challenges on the front of the season. And that will probably play out with some weed management implications this year. So we need to keep an eye on that.
Mm-hmm. I was going to add to that.
Mm-hmm.
And when looking at your planting populations, I know we've had a lot of conversation about you can go, how low can you go? And I'll let Rachel talk to that. But I know that, and I unfortunately on our own farm we've struggled. We really like to plant early soybeans, but we've had, it just seems like in the last couple of years, the massive amount of rain, the cold snaps, everything, where we know that we can have a lower population, let's say 50,000, which really did happen. But then we also, to Rachel's point, had to worry about weed pressure. And so we've learned on our own farm, even though I thought up until the last couple of years we had good weed control. I mean, we just really are seeing some weed breaks. And the earlier plant, those weeds are really coming on strong, like Rachel said. And so that played into our final, what should our final stands be? And we really needed to add. What we did was bump up our seed populations this year and last year, just because of the weather that we've had early on. And the other issue, Rachel, has been the seed quality thing, where we've talked about where some of the seed germ isn't quite there. And so we also have to bump up our populations because of that.
I mentioned Science for Success earlier. Rachel, can you talk about any of the work that they've done? I know it's a collective group effort funded by the United Soybean Checkoff, but talk about, what Stephanie mentioned with the planting stands and what that research has shown.
Sure. So Science for Success is a group of faculty at land grant institutions all across the United States that have soybean extension responsibilities. So there's about 25 of us that participate in this group, and we do collaborative research across the nation. And we do, I think, a pretty good job with effective outreach based on the data-driven information we get from that research. And so each year we're doing research on different topics, and we're doing outreach on a variety of things. One of the things the Science for Success team has done was really pool our resources across these states and look at replanting and the recommendations that we have across the nation. And I think some of the general consensuses from that work was in the southern U.S., I think you can often get away with 50,000 plants per acre population and be at max yield potential or close to max yield potential. Whereas what we found in these more northern environments is you'd want to be closer to 75,000 plants per acre final population as sort of your trigger to really think deeply about soybean replanting. But our group has also done a lot of work on how early planting affects soybean yield. And so I think it's really important when you're making these replant decisions to weigh a few things. What's the planting date penalty from the replant? What type of insurance coverage do you have for replant? What's the variability of the stand across your field? In my experience, Scott, in soybeans, these replant decisions aren't often either they're really easy, like it's so bad, yes, I have to replant this, or it's pretty difficult to make the decision because there's a lot of variability across the field, and what's causing the issue can be a little problematic if you're not entirely sure. Is it totally weather related? Is there some herbicide interaction from the previous season? Is there some disease issue with seedling diseases that you're not going to overcome with a replant decision? And so those resources by Science for Success look at those thresholds, talk about some of these major considerations when you're thinking about replanting, and I think drills down into some of the issues why you might be replanting. Like if you're replanting because you had freeze damage or freeze killed soybeans, you can overcome that with a replant, but there's some things, that you can't overcome with a replant. So that those resources talk through that.
What are some of those things you can't overcome with a replant?
I think Major waterlogged soils are one thing that you cannot necessarily outrun because you can't predict the weather. And I've watched fields by my house here in Champaign be flooded for 2 weeks in a row. I think there's some things you can't outrun there. If you've got some kind of herbicide carryover issue that's causing some issues, maybe it's synergizing with soybean seedling issues, you might not be able to resolve that with the replant. So I think it's just thinking through some of those issues.
I think we've had years where we knew we needed to replant, but it wouldn't stop raining. And then we actually got hail. So then you're for sure going to replant. But there's, times I think most people are familiar that you usually don't rip up the field and tear up the field, correct? You go back in. And I think that as an agronomist has been my biggest challenge, going back into fields and saying, they're like, well, how much more do you think we should put in? And so I was just going to ask you that, Rachel. What's your opinion on, if you have 50,000 plants per acre, how much do you go back in with? And, what growth stage V1, where do you kind of stop replanting, I guess, is another thing to address. And because it could be too late, and not because they waited too long, it's because of the weather. So what do you think there?
Yeah, I think those are some good questions. With soybeans, one of the benefits is there's a little bit more flexibility when you're planting into those fields. Every 3-day delay in planting, I think, is about a day delay in maturity. So you have to think about that. But, you could plant 15 days later and still only have a few day delay in maturity on the back end of the season. I think that question about how much should you be repair planting is very dependent on what your planting date is. Like, how delayed is your replant? Is it catastrophic? Are we talking about June? Are we talking about you planted April 15th, you're going to replant May 1st? I think that has a big difference. And then I also think it matters how bad your weed control situation is. I think to one of your points you made earlier, Stephanie, one of the reasons to consider replanting is to get ahead of some weed management challenges with plant to plant competition. And so I think that should also play into that decision. I don't think there's a straightforward, like it should be 20% more. I think it's highly dependent sort of on your unique situation.
What do you both think of? Okay, I've made the decision, I need to replant. What's your recommendation when going back into the field? Like, plant it at a different angle, or how does that look? The actual logistics of going back in and doing so.
I would say it's really on the farmer's preference. That everybody farms differently in the state, and I know that's a cop out, but they really do. And so we just talk through on what the farmer would like to do, and based on their current management practices, I would say. I know currently we have a lot of drowned out spots, and my brother went back in and just kind of hit those spots. I mean, we just had massive amounts of rain that moved residue. It wasn't necessarily ponding. And then he just went in and tried to, and it's very difficult, but try to go back into those spots just so they're not bare.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, you have anything to add?
No, my cop out was to let Stephanie answer that one. So,
so right now, I need to mention, diesel costs are high. That's another trip going back through the fields. You got to fuel that tractor back up to do so. So now you got to really throw that economic side into it. But I mean, how does that all factor into this as well, in your opinion, with the other costs of replant when it comes to, fueling up that tractor and the time and the labor that it goes into it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets back to a major consideration in the replant is the whole economics of it. Usually we're thinking about the seed cost economics. Do you have insurance coverage for replant? How can that interact with your situation? But I additionally think what you mentioned about the additional diesel cost is important. But at the end of the day, the research is pretty straightforward on this. If your populations across the field, and you need to have a good pulse on what the situation looks like across the field, in the Midwest have dropped below 70,000 seeds per acre. You need to be thinking seriously about replanting. I think regardless of sort of the input costs, once you get below that threshold, I don't know that the economics change that very much. I mean, the threshold is what it is. You're losing yield below a certain threshold of population.
And you definitely have to check with your seedsman, of course, but a lot of companies offer free replant if you have fully treated seeds. So a lot of guys do count on that, but always make sure that's in place. And there's been times where, there's been issues with seed availability as well. So other things that can factor in. If there's, massive amount of replant, you just got to make sure that you have seeds available to replant.
I mentioned earlier about the frost, and I know, Stephanie, when we've talked before, you just got to wait to see, is that waiting period over now? You got to make that decision now, or, if you think that frost got to those beans, how quickly do you have to make that decision whether to replant or not?
I think a lot of it depends on the growing conditions. I'm further south, so we've had more heat, obviously, than the north. But I have heard of, in the last several weeks, people evaluating soybeans and seeing regrowth. That's what you want to see. It's been very slow. We're going to have really good growing conditions coming up here. But that's what you want to see. And obviously look at some of those growing points, make sure they aren't dark and that type of thing. But I think the main thing is I've preached to be patient, and it's really hard to be patient. But you patiently wait and see, and that's the same with hail as well. And it's just those situations you have to see if those plants are regrowing.
And I think the benefit that we have right now is you're sort of, if you look at the data out of the University of Illinois, we're getting to mid-May now. You're going to start losing more soybean yield with each day delay in planting. But a lot of these beans that had some frost or freeze injury, I think many of them you can be making the decisions about replanting now. If you're talking about making a decision about replanting your beans that you planted June 1st on June 15th, well, the advantage you have at that point is the beans should be growing faster, and you should be able to make that assessment, which we typically say, 3 to 7 days. Well, probably if you're thinking about replanting in June, it's more like 3 or 4 days, to Stephanie's point.
One more note or question I have related to these beans that I already planted. I've noticed a lot of them took a long time to come up, and I know that worries some. It doesn't worry others. But is that the seed laying in the soil for so long, the amount of rainfall we've had to make those soil conditions wet? Is there any concern of early season disease or any other pests that should be on the watch out for in the next month or so?
So based on my past and being a seed agronomist, and a lot of people in the last 5-7 years planting early, I've seen beans be in the ground 3 to 4 weeks. And I know to some that just seems crazy, but I'm used to it. And it wasn't a common thing. And it also is very weather dependent, but the earlier you plant, the more risk you have, just for those beans to stay in the ground. And that's why we try to promote full seed treatments, just because of what you said, Kelsey, is that, the longer they sit in the ground, the higher the risk they have for possible disease, as well as insect injury. And Rachel, I don't know if you have any other comments to that, but it's pretty common practice here. It's nothing like alarming to me because I've seen it happen. To some, it might worry them, but we usually see beans. I mean, if it's good seed quality can impact it. And the other comment I want to make, and we've seen on our own farm, is vigor. So, especially in the slow growing conditions, you can really see differences in soybean varieties and vigor with your neighbor maybe down the road.
And I think for me, one reason I asked that question too, personally, like in my area, it's just been cold, like low 40s at night. And it's just like, man, and I agree with you. I'm like, oh, yeah, it'll take a while. But man, the conditions have just not seemed favorable this week. So I'll just let Rachel take the rest of that.
Yeah, I would just say in my experience, we were looking at all different planting dates in North Carolina, and we could see fully treated beans sit in the ground for 3-4 weeks. I was much more concerned about cold conditions after they emerged than I was them sitting in the ground, because for us down there, we could see flowering as early as mid-May, early May, really, sometimes. And so if they'd gotten off to a really slow start after they'd emerged, we could never overcome that on the back end of the season because we weren't accumulating enough heat units before they moved into reproductive development. So I was always much more concerned about that and what that meant for early season seedling diseases. Even if you had a seed treatment, your seed treatment had been on the seed in the ground for a month before it emerged. So what that meant for the plant's ability to interact with some of these pre-emergence herbicides, where we often see more injury early in the season. And so that's where I've seen more of the issues, is when beans are off to a slow start, which it seems like off to a slow start after they'd emerge, I should clarify, which it seems to be the case in some of Illinois this year.
And that's a good point. We have been getting some reports from some of the crop consultants in the South, especially maybe in some of those lower organic matter soils, places where they had really heavy rains. And it's kind of the perfect storm where some of those seeds were sitting, and they seemed to be having some herbicide injury type symptoms. It's all different types, but usually it's like a PPO or something like that. But there has been, and that'd be just another thing. Sometimes it looks worse than it really is. And again, you just have to get out there and take a planting population. I got a picture yesterday, you guys, that they're like, what do you think? And I'm like, well, that looks like a field that possibly might need a replant. I said, what's the soybean stands? What populations are you getting? I haven't taken them yet. And so I have been in some, especially no-till fields, where it looks a lot worse than it is. So you really have to, again, get out there. And to Rachel's point, it's easier said than done, but you have to go in all areas of the field and see what those populations are.
And we have had checkoff-funded research with Aaron Hager and Logan Miller, where they studied the injury assessment on early planted soybeans versus the herbicide. And from both, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, from both years, of the first year, I think there was more injury, but it was all weather dependent, and they came out of it just fine, essentially, if I understand everything correctly, right, Steph?
It has a lot to do with cold stress, but in some instances, it's plants that maybe were planted in not the best conditions too, whether it be crusted, cloddy soils, compacted. So you may need to take a look at other considerations that, other things that may have gone wrong too. And we can't always just blame the herbicide.
Okay, so a farmer listens to this podcast and they say, oh, Stephanie said I got to go plant corn now. So they go plant some corn because Stephanie said so. But then they go, well, I got to come back to beans. And I think everyone thinks, oh, early planted beans, they're going to yield the best. Our soy envoy, Jamie Horton, wrote a great blog that's on fieldadvisor.org, where she talks about, you could still get pretty good yields on later planted beans. You just have to have the right management strategy. So I want both of you to react to that of don't give up on those later planted soybeans. They could still be good yield pushers. Rachel, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm adjusting to the Illinois production practices based on many years of experience in North Carolina. But I think, a couple things that I'll emphasize is, first, Yes, you should increase your population as planting date is delayed, but I don't think it needs to be drastic. I think there's often overseeding of late planted soybeans more than you probably need to maximize yield. Now, we've talked a lot about the weed management situation. I think that's a factor. But at a mid-May planting date, you might think about increasing your population, maybe 5%. We're not talking drastic increases in seeding rate at this point in the season. As time moves along, and if you're getting into June planting, I think that's when you have to seriously start thinking about narrower rows. If you plant wider row soybeans and increasing your population maybe 10 to 20%. So I think those are some core things to consider. And from the research that I've seen in terms of maturity group adjustments, even when you get into some of these later planting situations, there's no real drastic maturity group adjustments. From what I've seen, the recommendations maybe are moving 0.5 maturity group earlier in your later planted soybeans. But we're hoping to do some more research in double crop soybeans in the state over the next couple of years, and hopefully that will help illuminate some of these recommendations when we're talking about really late planting, which I don't think is the case right here in mid-May.
Yeah, we have to look at the calendar. Oh, we're still mid-May. It feels it should be a lot later than that. I don't know why. Stephanie, you have anything to add?
No, I think she answered that great. And I look forward to working with Rachel. I know we have some double crop on-farm trials at ISA currently, and Rachel's helping us out with those. And some of those populations are pretty high on those. And so I think it's interesting because I know it's a common practice for those in the South. Because whenever I helped write that protocol for double crop, I asked a lot of different crop consultants, what they thought in the South, but is that the same planting population that should be in the North? Because there's so many more, not a lot, but a lot of interest in Central Illinois and Northern Illinois, where they're wanting to do some double crop. They look at wheat as a cash crop, but something where they, maybe not want to do a cover crop, but they want to do wheat. And then they want to look into double crop. And so, and does it matter with population, with maturity as well? Does that matter as well? So it'll be interesting. Illinois is a big state. So
yeah.
It's a lot going on, a lot of different maturity ranges. And so it'll be interesting to see what we find with the planting populations with double crop.
All right. Well, thank you both, Rachel and Stephanie, for being on the Field Advisor podcast. I know we'll be talking again this summer, so we'll pick this back up once we see what soybeans are, maybe in June or July. Thank you both. Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor podcast. Unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor podcast on your favorite podcast platform.